What can we learn from the characters from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Crime and Punishment really was an interesting novel. Similar to Dostoevsky's other book, The Brothers Karamazov, all of the characters here seem to come to life. They have their own unique personality, and I want to explore these characters today. They act as a representation of the types of lives that certain people lead. Not all of them, and maybe not realistic per se, but they kind of act as over-the-top exaggerations, but that makes them very powerful. In a sense, they reveal where certain paths and where certain ideologies can lead. The summary of the story, Crime and Punishment, is essentially this. The main character, Raskolnikov, is jaded with the world. He's poor. He has left university. He doesn't have much going on for him, and he comes to realize that his family are making tremendous sacrifices to send him money. He develops a very interesting philosophy from that. He finds that rules are meant to herd the sheep, but the truly revolutionary people, he would call them great men, overstep these rules to realize their greatness, and he was infatuated with the idea of Napoleon. Napoleon didn't follow the rules. He didn't abide by societal restrictions. He overstepped them. He became a leader, and he didn't do it by playing nice. Raskolnikov, in an egotistical way, started to view himself as one of these great men, and he was simply being held back by these rules and his circumstances. He was poor. He couldn't realize his true potential, and maybe there was some merit to overstepping these rules right now to get him to where he had to be, to where he could really change the way in which Russian society was functioning. Then at the same time, in his life, there was a prominent figure, a pawnbroker, who, by all measures, was a bad person. She rips people off. She abuses her innocent staff. She's rude. She's somebody who Raskolnikov views with contempt. The idea that the world would be a better place without her, the pawnbroker, comes to his mind. If he could take her wealth, he would be able to do so much good for the world. It's fundamentally unfair how the tables are set up. He has such good intentions, but he's poor. He can't act on it. And yet, here's somebody with the resources to change the world for the better, but she is seemingly just a ball of pure evil. This is where a second philosophy enters the equation. He comes to find that human life does not have intrinsic value. There might be some justification for killing her if I can produce good from it. Maybe she should be a sacrifice of sorts. So, Raskolnikov finally convinced himself that he is in fact one of these elites that he imagines, and that he needs to bypass the rules of society to achieve his potential, his birthright, to take his spot at the top of society. He also believes that this pawnbroker is worthless, and she should be his sacrifice. So, he kills her. And I haven't spoiled too much either. This all unfolds early in the book. I also haven't revealed a twist that happens, so you can look forward to that. But I want to look at this character, Raskolnikov, first. After he commits his crime, his philosophies fall apart rather fast. He becomes a shell. He wasn't one of the elites who get to bypass the rules. He realizes that. As a matter of fact, we have no way of determining who is and who isn't. He's just a regular man, a regular fellow, who committed murder, and that crushes him. But the victim, he thought, was a plague on the earth. That does not matter, though. The act of taking a life so deeply wounds him that he has become a different person altogether. Prior to this, he loved his family. He knew they were struggling for him, and after, he became cold to them. In fact, he became cold to almost everybody. The very reason why he supposedly committed this murder in the first place was lost to him. He didn't do any good with the money. Well, there was some examples here and there, but overall, he didn't live up to his aspirations. And what happened? He was left with psychological torture. In other words, his conscience started to gnaw at him. He began to juggle the idea of confessing versus hiding, the idea of justice versus evil, and finally, he appeared to just go mad. In a sense, this was one form of punishment for his crime and punishment. He realizes that a man who has a conscience suffers whilst acknowledging his sin. That is punishment as well as his prison. And that's quite powerful. So of course, there is a prerequisite there. You need a functioning conscience for this to apply to you. If you commit a crime, that you recognize as sinful after, your mind will tear you apart. That is, in fact, a part of your punishment and a prison of sorts, because you are not free to operate in the world as you would anymore. You're almost cut off from society at a deep moral level. You don't feel like you belong anymore. You feel like you've done something to ostracize yourself, and your mind is playing gymnastics trying to weigh the pros and the cons and to figure out what exactly it was that you just did. Raskolnikov is essentially the sorrowful sinner by the end of the book. The man who was wrong in the world, and he knows it. He feels it, but he has trouble coming to grips with making things right, and thus suffers for it. Now, of course, I did mention that this is a form of caricature. Not everyone is committing crimes on the level of murder and then contemplating it after, but in a sense, we all experience that to a lesser degree. When we do something we know is fundamentally unjust, the psychological gymnastics of your conscience begins to tear you apart, pushing you to a solution almost, an attempt to unstain yourself, to unsully yourself from the crimes or sins that you have committed. And your prideful struggle to justify whatever your action was begins to manifest. You end up fighting yourself. It's you trying to justify whatever it is that you did versus your conscience, and your conscience is almost a form of truth. It's trying to reveal to you what exactly transpired and how you should feel, how you ought to react, but you, in an egotistical kind of way, similar to Raskolnikov, will resist that for as long as you can, until you're driven mad. Now, if your conscience is malfunctioning, or you don't have one, because you're a psychopath of sorts, then yeah, the equation will be different. But generally speaking, this punishment is quite substantial. Now, near the end, Dostoevsky puts forward the truth as being the first step to being set free from these chains, this constant battle of your conscience versus your pride. Then, the second step is correcting your mistakes as required. Raskolnikov throughout the book tried to correct for his evil through indirect means, but that was a failure. He gave people some money, but it wasn't enough to clear his conscience because it didn't address his initial wrong. And that's powerful. You have to trace it back to the root of your sorrow. Now, another character that I found interesting was a guy called Marmeladov. What a sad man he was. He was an alcoholic, but he was conscious though. A conscious alcoholic, and that is likely the most tragic form. To understand what you're doing is bad, but to still be succumbing to it. His family was in destitute poverty. He had a job, but he lost it due to his addiction. Then he got the job back, but he couldn't keep it because drinking was his chief concern. It was almost like he was aware of his failings, but he felt powerless to change anything. He knew he had destroyed any chance for his family to live decently, and still, he continued to behave in ways that were counterproductive to it. He knew alcohol was the problem, yet here he was in a bar getting wasted, and he had a sick sort of twisted humor with it. He told Raskolnikov that he would drink just so the pain would hurt more. He knew what he did was terrible. His conscience was telling him that. And in his form of self-administered punishment, he would get super wasted every day just so it hit home just how much of a failure he really was. He felt terrible, yet he did not feel like he could change anything. We have here a man who lacks hope. A man who is too comfortable in his current surroundings and doesn't have the courage to get up and change anything. He constantly repeats this theme of everyone needing a place to go. This was his place. Without the drinks, who was he? Where did he belong? This was him, his identity. He gave into that. Instead of trying to carve out a path forward, he accepted his fate and all the tragedy that comes with it. He had this salient inability to live without alcohol. To some extent, many people mirror that. Of course, not to the level of this caricature, but to some lesser degree. Engage in destructive behavior that they can recognize. They know the harm they are causing, whether to them or to someone else, but when asked why they don't stop, they don't know. Is it an impulse? Is it an addiction? Is it a habit? It's clear that it's easier to go back to your comfort place, but to move toward improvement, that's essential and it's going to be painful. Your desire to break free from whatever is containing you must be greater than your desire to be comfortable. Otherwise, you won't move, but when that delta occurs, you can harness it to make the changes you need to make. Marmeladov did not have that motivation. He was comfortable being where he was at. That was his place to go, and he saw the damages it did, but he couldn't find the motivation to change anything. Now, don't even get me started on his family. That's a whole other tragic tale, but I will talk about one of them. He has a daughter called Sonya, who, due to her father's ineptitude, is forced to prostitute herself to give her mother and siblings money to survive. That's the only way they can do that. So, she endures all the hardships that come with it. She was devoutly religious too, so you can imagine how much of a toll that is on her. To be forced into the flames of sin, or be left in dire poverty. Prostitution to her was not a noble means of living, as some people might believe it is today. To her, it was the depths of this, the lowest depth she could sink to. There was no other choice but to do this. It was an act of self-sacrifice that went against her beliefs, but still, that was the only path for her if she wanted her family to survive. What a choice. Now, she's also a timid girl, a kind girl, someone who is just scared of everyone, but people viewed her as contemptible, as evil. She's even kicked out of her mother's lodgings because the other tenants don't want a harlot in the building. Despite all of this, despite all of the turmoil in her life, and things get way worse for the family, she powers through and does not lose hope in a better tomorrow. The first lesson to be drawn here is not to cast judgment too quickly. You may see the prostitution, but you may not grip the circumstances at play. You might not yet understand the motives here. If you knew her as a person, you'd be very surprised to know that people view her in such a negative light. She is just lovely, as Raskolnikov finds out in the novel. If she had been born into a separate family, her life would have been drastically different. But her circumstances affected her and forced her hand. That is nothing but bad luck. It says nothing about her. It says everything, though, about the state of that society. You must ask yourself, too, if you were in her shoes, what would you have done? She didn't control these circumstances. She didn't put herself in that position. But, nevertheless, she still had to act within it. If you were in her shoes, would you take the same route? Or would you take the more selfish approach and not stain yourself, but have your family suffer? Either way you lose. It's a terrible dichotomy. But that's the reality that not only her, but a lot of people have to live by today, before, and going to the future, it'll still be present. This is also, though, somebody with a purpose. Someone who knows their why. They can bear anyhow. She sells herself because people depend on her. She has a family to tend to. She must ensure their security. That reason, that why, gets her through the horrors of living. If you do not have a purpose, you don't have a why. It's hard to endure. Things will crush you, but you need a reason to fight back. Everyone needs that. You must discover it for yourself. Even someone in the darkest of situations, like Sonya over here, can persevere given the right reason. You have to find yours. A lot of people already do that. They put up with tragedy and they continue to move forward because they have something worth surviving for. It would be unthinkable for them to jump off a cliff because there are things left unfinished, things that matter to them. They have identified a reason to go on. Life is fundamentally suffering. You will encounter it if you live long enough. It's almost a guarantee. So, you have to be prepared to weather that storm. Now, there's also another great character, and his name is Razumikin. He is the idealist. He is Raskolnikov's best friend, and he refuses to believe that he murdered anyone. He won't have it. He has strong beliefs and always reverts back to kindness and reason. He says that to go wrong in one's own way is better than to go right in someone else's. Only an idealist would welcome failure in the name of walking your own path. But I still like that. I applaud it. Razumikin is almost a reflection of Raskolnikov had he been slightly more optimistic. Razumikin is also poor, and he was forced to drop out of university. A situation that mirrors Raskolnikov's closely. Instead, though, of plotting against the world, he worked hard. He was saving money, and he did not lose hope. He walked his path. I believe the author was attempting to portray the degree to which your suffering is somewhat contingent on your perspective. On one hand, you have someone who views their situation as just disdainful. The other person, though, believes in a better tomorrow and they work towards it nobly. One of them is unable to radiate any type of goodness. They can't do anything properly in the world, and they're driven to madness. And the other person, though, is a symbol of hope. They attract people. People believe in them. The story you tell yourself matters, and your perspective is going to change the way in which you react to certain outcomes in the world. These two people faced very similar situations. One of them was driven to murder. He deluded himself into believing that he was a chosen one and he was allowed to do it. And the other worked hard. He stayed humble. He knew his situation was terrible. There's no excusing that. The society let him down, but still, he didn't turn his back on the world. And as a result, he was able to make out of it with a more optimistic perspective. He lived a good life. If everyone was a Razumikin of sorts, well, the world would be a far better place. Now, finally, the last character I want to talk about is this guy named Svdrilogov. His story is one of placing all your chips on one thing and entering a deep form of nihilism when it doesn't work out. So, long story short, he pursues a woman that he deeply loves. He goes to some radical lengths to get with her, so he's plotting for a very long time. When he was married, he essentially tried to cheat on his wife, and she died and he felt that he was free, so he went after the woman one-on-one now. He sets up an elaborate plot to trap her in a room, and he locks the door so she can't escape. She starts to get scared, and he's there, and he offers her a proposition, one that matters to her. I don't want to tell you what exactly, but he's saying, I will do something that you deeply care about. I will help this person if you let me have my way with you. Then she freaks out and she says, no, I refuse to accept that. And he's shocked by that. He says, whoa, I thought that she would just comply. So he still tries to press himself onto her, and she pulls out a gun. She shoots him the first time, and she misses. Then he says, hey, reload your gun and shoot me again. And she does that, but she misses again. And at this point, he begins to realize something. He's welcoming death. And why is that? It became painfully clear to him that not only would she never genuinely love him, but even under threat, she still wouldn't even lie about loving him. So he just dies a little bit on the inside. He becomes cognizant of the fact that nothing he does is going to enable him to gain what he wants here. That crushes him. His goal, he realizes, is unattainable. Now, after this whole thing happens, he opens the door and lets her out, and he's just crushed. You can tell he doesn't care anymore. He ends up giving away all of his money, and after that, he kills himself. He had one goal. Everything he did was seemingly centered around that. What that was ended up being destroyed in front of his very eyes, and he saw no meaning to life anymore. He entered a deep form of nihilism. Nothing matters, my life is over. Things are crushed now. There is no hope in a tomorrow. The lesson here that we need to draw is you must be adaptable. One door closes, another one opens type thing. What we target as our source of meaning needs to be flexible. Maybe you accomplish your mission one day. Maybe you fail. Maybe you change your mind. These things will happen. The quest for meaning isn't a one-time thing. It might be if you are lucky, but often you will need to pivot. You need to believe that you can pivot, and there is something more to living. There's something for you to discover. There is no shortage of noble aims to pursue in life, and after some downtime, after recovering from your loss, you must pick yourself back up. This guy here never picked himself back up. He wallowed in despair, and eventually it crushed him. He let nihilism consume his entire being. He saw nothing left to do in life, and so he got down to business. He got rid of all of his money. He did some last acts of kindness, and eventually there he went and he killed himself. But he didn't know what tomorrow had in store. He didn't know about whether or not another girl will come into his life that he would feel affection for. Instead, he let nihilism consume himself and it took over his soul. He was driven to a form of madness himself. Now, all of these characters here that I'm talking about are forms of extremes. Maybe you are crushed by something, but you're not going to go kill yourself, but you could very well find yourself just chained to your bed. You could find yourself with no hope for the future. You may not go that final step, but you could easily fall on the spectrum of nihilism, the spectrum of this being demotivated. These things can happen to you. You might find yourself in a situation where something similar to one of these characters is plaguing your life. These are examples of how things can go really bad for you. You might be facing an addiction, or you may be contemplating doing something bad, but your conscience is battling you. This is the beauty of these stories here. It gives you an inside perspective on how the psychology will play out, a connection, a learning experience. You don't have to have murdered somebody to understand how Raskolnikov was feeling, because it is explained to you explicitly in the book. Once again, the stupidity of intersectionality. You don't have to hold these arbitrary traits to understand somebody who's gone through a situation. You don't have to be like them to know it. We have reason to enable that connection. This is why reading opens your mind to a variety of different worldviews, to a variety of different experiences that you would not be able to live on your own. But you can gain insight onto the ways in which the mind operates in a given circumstance. You can understand the motivations behind an action. You can understand the consequences for doing something. That's all very powerful. And therefore, I must conclude that Dostoevsky has a talent with writing. His other book, The Brothers Karamazov, was equally powerful, if not more so, than this book here. There are definitely things worth reading, and I find it very interesting that the lessons that you draw are going to be subjective. In these books here, nothing is really explicitly spelled out for you. There's a lot of interpretation. It's very fun to go through it and compare what you think versus what someone else drew from it. It's probably going to be different, but that's the beauty of it. You can make your own meaning from the story presented to you. I highly recommend looking at these books here when you have time. So, that now brings me to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at PerryPlatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.